On this Tuesday night, a group home operator accused of over-medicating children in care.
I felt like a zombie at one point.
As we confront a psychiatrist who wrote those prescriptions.
All that is nonsense, okay? I'm done, you get out.
Global News investigates. Defending the use of emergency powers to stop the convoy protests.
It was on the brink of being completely ungovernable, if not already by then.
Why Canada's public safety minister believes what the government did was justified. Plastic pollution solution.
There's nothing similar.
A BC team's groundbreaking alternative to styrofoam. And this guy needs a bigger fish tank. The giant goldfish caught in France.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with a Global News investigation, a report into Ontario's child welfare system that was quietly released by the Association of Children's Aid Societies last spring shows 3/4 of kids in group homes were taking mood-altering psychotropic medications in 2021. These are kids who have been abused, neglected, orphaned, or have mental health or behavioral issues. Tonight, we hear from whistleblowers from a for-profit group home company who say kids are being over-medicated instead of getting therapy to deal with their trauma. Carolyn Jarvis has our top story tonight.
When Tashina Burnett and Jamar Morrison entered Ontario's child welfare system, what they needed was compassion and help healing.
Did you get help?
No, I got medication.
At group homes run by a for-profit company called Hats Off, they and other kids say they were over-medicated.
Oh, yeah, very over-medicated.
Prescribed serious, behavior-altering drugs.
How many of the kids in the home were on medicine?
Everybody. Every single kid.
Global News spoke with more than a dozen former workers and kids in care who expressed serious concerns about the overuse of medication. Prescribed, they say, to deal with things like depression and anger.
These kids are supposed to be angry.
We've concealed former workers' identities for fear of retaliation.
Because they had trauma.
They had trauma and they missed their families.
Hats Off says it has a full-time psychotherapist on staff, and kids receive weekly or bi-weekly therapy, which may include trauma therapy, CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, addictions counseling, or art therapy. But kids and workers we spoke with say they only had occasional art therapy, which didn't help.
In all the homes that I've been to, I haven't seen a single instance of actual traditional counseling.
Who they did see was a psychiatrist, on retainer with Hats Off for years, Dr. Ramakrishna Surapanini.
That was him, Surapanini.
He was the essential piece to Hats Off's foundation. Without him, you wouldn't be able to keep all the kids drugged and medicated.
Former workers and youth say appointments were brief, and the amount of medication almost always increased.
Your supervisor tells you that this kid clearly is depressed. You should go to Dr. Surapanini and tell them he's having this. And then based on that 5-10 minute interaction, the doctor signs the prescriptions and you're good to go.
You left these appointments with Dr. Surapanini and suddenly you were being told.
Now I'm on antidepressants and a whole bunch of other crap.
Medication is a good social control mechanism and it works. It keeps them almost comatose.
And while some kids objected to taking medication, they felt they had no choice.
You don't force them to take them, but you make it very hard for them to refuse.
Like, you're not going to be allowed electronics. We're going to take away Lego.
If tomorrow we're going to go do something, well, you're not going to go.
Hats Off says it would never direct a staff to force a resident to take medication or reprimand them. The fallout of the mounting medication, say former youth, was disastrous.
I felt like a zombie at one point. I was sleeping all the time. I was moody, sad.
I even got heavily suicidal at one point, to the point where I actually tried to hang myself in the closet.
And you think that's because of the medicine?
100%.
Hats Off, which declined an on-camera interview, said in an email that it relies on healthcare professionals, and it would be beyond the scope for it to question or interfere with a treatment plan, including medication.
Did you blow the whistle on this to anybody?
All the time to your supervisors, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's part of the system to run this whole thing. The drugs are integral to this.
As for Dr. Surapanini,
Carolyn Jarvis with Global News.
We met up with him outside his office in Waterloo.
Several former group home youth from the Hats Off group home chain contacted us because they expressed concerns about being over-medicated after coming to see you.
All that is nonsense, okay?
Why is it nonsense?
It's done. Get out.
Well, some of these youth said that they were
You
suicidal.
get out. That's all. No.
What sort of tools do you give a youth who comes to see you to deal with trauma?
I'm done with you.
Today, Tashina only takes one medication, while Jamar doesn't take any. Meanwhile, Hats Off continues to use Dr. Surapanini as their consulting psychiatrist. Carolyn Jarvis, Global News.
Tomorrow, in part 3 of our investigation, we seek accountability and uncover a secret draft report that shows the government knew of concerns at Hats Off years ago. Canada's public safety minister says it became virtually impossible to enforce the law in downtown Ottawa during the so-called Freedom Convoy in February. Marco Mendicino testified today at the public inquiry into whether invoking the Federal Emergencies Act was warranted. He said he believed the nature of the protest and the challenges to restore public safety met the threshold for invoking the act.
We were concerned about whether or not the blockade might target the Prime Minister. This was a movement that in some cases was prepared to attack our democratic institutions to force change.
Mendicino also told the Commission events at the border in Coutts, Alberta earlier this year played a significant role in influencing the government's decision to invoke the act. David Aiken reports.
In my opinion, this was an illegal protest that was national in scale.
That opinion, held by Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino, appears to have been widely held by Trudeau's cabinet and some of his most senior advisors. That's according to testimony given in this final week of hearings by the Commission reviewing the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act last winter.
In ultimately forming the opinion that we needed to invoke the Emergencies Act, one of my main concerns was the inability to enforce the law adjacent to critical infrastructure.
That critical infrastructure the government was worried about was not just border crossings and highways, but Parliament Hill itself.
These are federal democratic institutions, but we did not have total jurisdiction over that space.
The tipping point for Mendicino was the situation at Coutts, Alberta, where undercover RCMP officers discovered weapons among those blockading the border there. 4 protesters were arrested, each charged with conspiracy to commit murder, among other things. And even though the Coutts blockade was resolved before the Emergencies Act was invoked on February the 14th, Mendicino said the RCMP operation at Coutts was what he called a threshold moment.
I was extremely concerned that this had reached a new height of both urgency and emergency.
A lawyer for the convoy organizers wanted to challenge Mendicino's opinions, but that lawyer, Brendan Miller, got kicked out of the commission room for arguing procedure with the judge overseeing the process.
You're speaking, I'm speaking. Been ruled on, and they've been filed for days. I will take a break while you're asked to leave.
Miller then claimed the whole process was unfair, set up to blame former Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly for the events leading up to Cabinet's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act.
They have tried to turn this entire proceeding into an inquiry about the failures of Chief Slowly, as opposed to actually about the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
More cabinet ministers testify Wednesday, including Justice Minister David Lametti. David Aiken, Global News, Ottawa.
A former Army reservist who crashed his truck through the gates of Rideau Hall in Ottawa has been granted day parole. On July 2, 2020, Corey Hearn rammed the Rideau Hall gates. Armed with 2 shotguns and a semi-automatic rifle, he abandoned his vehicle and went looking for the Prime Minister in what a judge called a politically motivated armed assault intended to intimidate Canada's elected government. During a 90-minute armed standoff, he told police he was angry about gun laws and COVID-19 restrictions. Last year, Hearn pleaded guilty to 7 weapons-related charges. He was sentenced to 6 years. His application for full parole was denied. His day parole is conditional on getting a job, undergoing counseling, and taking his prescribed medication. Canada's chief electoral officer appeared before a government committee today to discuss suspected foreign interference in Canada's 2019 federal election. Stéphane Perreault says he was not previously aware of any specifics regarding alleged campaigns of interference by Beijing. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also says he did not have any information on federal candidates receiving money from China. Sources have told Global News that Canadian intelligence officials delivered sensitive briefings warning Trudeau and select members of his cabinet about allegations China was running sophisticated operations. Eric Sorensen reports.
The Prime Minister repeated that in his security briefings he was not told about funding of federal candidates specifically by the Chinese government.
There has never been any information given to me on the funding of federal candidates by China.
Trudeau did not address reporting by Global News that sources say a clandestine election interference network was covertly funded by Chinese state entities in the 2019 federal election, and that the Prime Minister was briefed in 2022 by Canadian intelligence officials on these stunning allegations of political interference schemes. Canada's chief electoral officer says he's not aware of Beijing interfering beyond Global News reports.
I've not received any reports regarding specific instances of noncompliance with the legislation or specific instances of Chinese interference in the election.
Was the Prime Minister briefed, yes or no?
The opposition says the government is not being transparent about just what the Prime Minister was briefed on. The government is avoiding specifics.
We're taking action to combat attempted foreign interference, Mr. Speaker, beginning with our national security agencies, who conduct investigations.
Separate sources with knowledge of the 2022 intelligence briefs told Global News funds from the Chinese consulate in Toronto, allegedly facilitated by a Toronto businessman, Wei Chung-yi, totaling some $250,000, was transferred first to an unnamed Ontario MPP and a federal candidate staff member. Wei Chung-yi denies the allegations. From there, sources say the money was distributed to members of a clandestine network. Intelligence says the network was comprised of at least 11 federal candidates, along with 13 campaign staffers. According to the intelligence, some are wittingly affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, some are not. Sources say the network includes Liberals and Conservatives. Justice Minister David Lametti suggested the need for caution in revealing too much publicly.
Obviously, there's a need for transparency, but there's also a need for our security services to protect their sources, to protect the methods in which they gather intelligence. All of that is important, and so we need to act prudently.
A former CSIS officer worries that intelligence officials haven't adequately briefed the Prime Minister.
Prudence is not necessarily a bad advice for the general public, but definitely if you speak to the Prime Minister, you need to be forthcoming.
Juno Katsuya says one thing Canada must do is to toughen Canadian laws to crack down on money transfers that could constitute interference in Canadian elections. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Hundreds of Canadian gymnasts have shared their stories of abuse as part of a study into the safety of sport in Canada. Some of them spoke in Ottawa today, trying to get the attention of politicians and sport leaders in the country.
For the past 5 years, I've been kept in silence as a former gymnast and abuse survivor. A judicial inquiry is so needed for athletes like all of us up here who left the sport broken instead of enriched.
The study is being led by Ontario Member of Parliament Karen Vecchio. She echoed the athletes' calls for a judicial inquiry, adding that now is the time to get involved in order to protect the next generation of athletes from facing the same kind of trauma. Excitement is building as Canada's men's soccer team prepares to kick off their first World Cup match in 36 years. Head coach John Herdman delivered some good news ahead of tomorrow's game. The entire team is healthy and able to play. Coach Herdman says the superstar striker Alphonso Davies is fully fit and will play. The 22-year-old was hurt in a game a few weeks ago. Canada has to contend with Belgium and then Croatia and Morocco if it's going to advance past the group stage. There was a stunning outcome to one match today. Saudi Arabia beat Argentina 2-1. It's one of the greatest upsets in soccer history. Argentina scored 3 goals in the first half that were all ruled offside. And then the Saudis scored twice in the second half to stun the soccer world. Argentina had won 36 straight games until today. Saudi Arabia is rejoicing. Tomorrow has been declared a public holiday to celebrate. Searching for a second night. Coming up, the rising death toll after that powerful earthquake in Indonesia. Canada has announced more sanctions on Belarus over its support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly says 22 officials and 16 companies are being added to the list. Joly says the Lukashenko regime is allowing its land to serve as a launching pad for Russian attacks on Ukraine and enabling human rights violations. Today, Joly met the country's exiled opposition leader in Ottawa. Svetlana Tikhonoshaya says she's hoping Canada will put economic and political pressure on the regime.
Canada have been standing for free and democratic Belarus for many, many years, and your support gives us hope and energy to move forward.
The head of Ukraine's national energy company calls the damage to that country's power grid colossal. Russia has been targeting power generating facilities with missile strikes. The energy company says practically no thermal or hydroelectric stations have been left unscathed. Repairs are underway, but it's a massive job. Rolling power outages are expected to continue through the winter. Rescuers in Indonesia are working through a second night to try to find survivors trapped after Monday's powerful earthquake. Many of the dead and injured are children. More than 22,000 buildings collapsed when the 5.6 magnitude quake struck early in the afternoon when kids were in school. Officials say more than 260 people have died, 150 are still missing. Authorities are scrambling to provide shelter, clean water, and food for the nearly 60,000 people who have lost their homes. Carbon pricing controversy ahead, the fee being applied in parts of Atlantic Canada next year. The federal government is expanding its carbon pricing scheme, rolling it out in 3 more provinces, Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland and Labrador. As Ross Lord reports, much of the money will be returned in rebates, but provincial governments are still disappointed by the decision.
While forcing its carbon pricing plan on 3 more provinces, the federal government is trying to accentuate the positive.
More families will get the climate action incentive checks more often.
To make up for the fact, more consumers will be paying extra at gas pumps. Until now, the fuel charge was applied in Ontario, Manitoba, Yukon, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Nunavut. Consumers in Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland and Labrador will start paying more, both at the pumps and to heat their homes, starting next July. 4 others, BC, the Northwest Territories, Quebec, and New Brunswick, have their own pricing systems. Nova Scotia calls the measure punitive.
A 14-cent increase at the price of the pump in Nova Scotia, it's going to have an impact.
Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston says he fought to the end against a measure that will hurt rural residents and will not reduce emissions in his province. The feds insist most Canadians will get more money back in rebates than they spend on the fuel charge.
Frankly, I'm baffled by Premier Houston's position.
Just as the government prefers to focus on rebates, the federal Conservatives are fixated on the fuel charge.
Happy Canada Day! Your gas bills, your heating bills, and your grocery bills have just gone up. That's the message from Liberals to 3 Atlantic Canadian provinces.
The controversy leaves voters with plenty to consider.
There's a sense of whose message is going to resonate more. There's a palpable sense of fatigue with the Liberal government. And so if Poilievre doesn't overplay his hand, I think he's actually in quite a good spot.
The government is changing the way it delivers the payments. Instead of including them in annual income tax rebates, checks will be mailed out to Canadians 4 times a year. Another step in highlighting the positives of a controversial policy. Ross Lord, Global News.
Biofoam breakthrough next. The BC research team making advancements to replace styrofoam. Try fitting this in your fish tank. This is Carrot, a carp-koi hybrid, believed to be the 2nd largest ever caught. Carrot lives in a lake in France and weighs more than 30 kilograms. That's about 67 pounds. It took this British angler more than 25 minutes to reel it in. He posed for some pictures and then released it. Carrot was put into the lake about 20 years ago and just keeps growing, but rarely gets caught. In British Columbia, a group of researchers has teamed up with a local First Nation in a partnership aimed at tackling one of the world's biggest polluters. It's a new packing material they hope will become a commercially viable and environmentally friendly alternative to styrofoam. Neethu Garcha explains.
These UBC researchers are turning wood waste,
those are the wood residues, slashings
from the forestry.
Into a biodegradable foam in hope it'll one day replace styrofoam, which can take 500 years to decompose in landfills.
My dream is there will be no more styrofoam packaging floating and also floating in the landfill, in the ocean. So it will be everything will become the biofoam.
The potential pollution solution, a partnership with Wet'suwet'en First Nation, developed 3 years ago when both groups met at a BC Forest Ministry event after the Indigenous community expressed concerns about wood waste created from pine beetles and wildfires.
We needed to find a way to use everything we have in the forest rather than, just piling up and burning it.
What they've done instead is grind the wood waste into a fiber and using biodegradable chemicals turned it into a foam, which then goes into the oven.
Right now, there's nothing similar in the North American market.
The researchers say they're confident about that process of turning BC forestry waste and eventually even agricultural waste into this biofoam product. So a key question now is whether it's a viable commercial scale alternative to styrofoam.
The production cost here in the lab is 1/5 of the retail price of the styrofoam.
He says the biggest cost is sourcing the wood waste from the forest. They're looking for investors to create a pilot project by next year to test out the technology at a larger scale.
Probably you can start to see this packaging material in the market maybe after 3-4 years.
The project's intellectual property is shared by Zhang's team and Wet'suwet'en First Nation.
Getting clean water and housing and education and health and wellness and making sure we're, putting revenue to those 4 pillars.
A lab-grown plan with big potential to help the planet. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Vancouver.
That is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Air Canada is this bird's eye view of Toronto. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.